Okay, so before I mentioned before that Gorochu was scrapped for like other reasons, but I was actually looking at some of the other reasons what they could have brought it back as, and even though the concept doesn't really fit into this scenario, but it does kind of resemble something else though. So here's my argument. Okay, so in Gen 2, when Gen 1 was made, there was Gorotora, which was a Pokemon that would later be recycled in the Electric Tiger Raitora, which would later on be recycled into, Raikou, the legendary dog. So Goro Gorochu would obviously be like some kind of a thunder god, a mouse in this case. But obviously that didn't work out though, because they figured Pikachu was the mascot and then they wanted to kind of keep it like sort of more balanced and tamed. So it never fitted out the way they wanted it to. So what I think they did was Gorochu ended up getting scrapped, and the concept of Gorochu ended up becoming something more fitting for like another type of god genie. Like later on, we go from like changing a few things around, and maybe something like to the word like Thundurus, for example, in Gen 5 comes all of a sudden. Because when you usually think of Japanese gods of some kind, you usually think of like something flying in a cloud or usually something like that. I'm not thinking like Anubis, like Dragon Ball Z and all that, but usually when you look at like Japanese gods, they usually have like these they're usually like flying, like not just flying around, but they're like a symbolic deity where it's they got like these a thunder god could also have like these chain, not just chains around them, but like these little like drum emblems they might have. And I could totally see like Thundurus kind of having something similar, even though it's more of just a genie, a god genie. And so I wouldn't be surprised that that's what they decided to do with the concept of Gorochu, in the sense that they wanted to recycle it into something else, because the connection would kind of be like that was another kind of a god of legendaries that they used that was a thunder type, that it was really the next one I can think of, because nowhere else in the series can I think of that, other than Raikou, was a god, an electric legendary god of some kind. And the Generation 5 would be the next one outside of, I mean, because if you think about, Gen 4 didn't have an electric god, Gen 3 didn't have an electric god, um, Gen 2 was mostly Raikou and all that, so they already had that concept. Zapdos was Gen 1, but Zapdos was more of like just an electrical bird, though. It wasn't, and it was a strong one, but it wasn't a god, though, in the sense that, it was more of like, more self-claimed, It was just a bird that kind of existed, A really strong bird, though, but it wasn't like a god bird. Although I do think Zapdos was kind of like a sub-god, but it wasn't like the god of thunder directly, So that's the concept. I think they just decided it made more sense. Like Thundurus would probably have been that concept that they were really thinking about implementing the name into. So maybe it's possible that the term Gorochu would have then supposed to be based on like a god of thunder and a mouse, but it was they reconsidered it, and then they took that concept and it went off and inspired like something else later on down the line, because that would be the next legendary that you could think of, not Gorochu, but like the next legendary that we could think of that this concept would come back to would be the genie god, Thundurus in this case, as well as Landorus and Tornadus, which even though they are a wind and a ground type, completely different creatures though, but are gods nonetheless though, in their own trio, the weather trio, I believe. even though we already have a weather trio, but you know, there were different trios. Different trios with similar powers. While they were different, came from different parts of the region, but they had mysterious powers nonetheless. And so they coexisted in some way or another to form some kind of mystical powers. So that's very interesting to think about. I wouldn't be surprised. We've definitely seen some concept arts that were probably there from the very beginning, and then they decided to come back to them somehow, one way or another. It's kind of interesting to see what they really do with some of these ideas. So I think that's cool. But yeah. So as far as Pokemon goes, that does not surprise me at all. Okay. So yeah. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I'm just trying to think. Yeah, I think that's probably it though. But other than that, I would want to say like you know they had like ideas from Gen 1, reused it in Gen 5. We've seen like Sobble, for example, had kind of something similar with like how they had something from Gen 1, then Gen 2's prototype, and then all the way up until Gen 8, and then they decided to do something about it. So that was actually kind of interesting. So it wouldn't surprise me if they did the same thing with Gorochu. Gorochu was scrapped, but they took the concept of a strong electric god, and maybe that inspired another group of Pokemon that could later on have inspired something else. Because I think what happened was too, a lot of Pokemon that a lot of you know godlike Pokemon were just reworked into something else later on. The only thing I can think of is Thundurus. Gorochu's concept art was reworked into Thundurus because it actually made a lot more sense to rework the concept of Gorochu if they weren't going to use it, but they wanted to use like another version of a lightning god that was more realistic in Japanese mythology. And it actually works very well when you see some of the concept arts that they based a lot of the Japanese thunder gods on. It's very interesting if you actually do a little research. So I'd say Thundurus himself is more believable as a thunder god than like say something like Raikou, for example. I definitely do think they both are fitting for their electric advantages, but it does make a lot of sense coming from a cultural standpoint why they do the things they do and why they look the way they do, in a lot of sense. So you guys tell me what you think, but this is what I've come across, and I think it makes a lot of sense in a sense. Even though, I mean, they're genies though, so they're not mouses, but you know, Thundurus is definitely a very strong electrical god. Can still be taken out easily if you got the right advantage, but that's what Thundurus was, though, was a gigantic thunder god, lightning god. So I think that's interesting. So anyways, so subscribe. If I find any more information, I'll have to update you on this, but I think this is a pretty good, interesting argument to really go off of, though.